My topic today is what I would call presence. And by this, I have in mind the idea that the world shows up for us. It's present to mind, it's present in thought, it's present in experience. So this is the sort of the term I'm going to use to try to, as I go on, articulate the subject. I talk about the world showing up to us, but one might think of presence in terms of our showing up. Here we are. And it strikes me, and this motivates me, that one of really this problem of presence, of understanding how we show up, how the world shows up for us in thought and experience, is really the problem that we try to confront when we try to understand the nature of the mind. Now, most scientists who think about presence, as I'm calling it, and also most philosophers in this area, tend to think that the way to unpack the notion of presence is in terms of representation. We represent the world in perception, we represent the world in cognition. I'm going to try today, in many ways repeating, and in some ways following up on, and trying to go beyond some of the work that Jesse just referred to. I'm going to try to suggest an alternative way of thinking about presence, not as a representation, not as a process by which representations occur inside of us, but rather something that live, whole, embodied human beings embedded in situations that include the social environment achieve. Presence doesn't come for free. It's not done automatically. It's something that we achieve. And I want to begin by talking about the topic of visual presence, in part because this is an area where I think I can begin to get some of the core ideas that I want to work with clear and intuitive for us to think about. But by the end of the talk, I want to be talking about presence in general, so all presence in thought and experience. Visual presence is also a good place for me to start because it's where I started in action and perception, which I guess I started working on and writing about 17 years ago. And just because we're such a small, intimate group, although as I say that, people are coming in who I've never seen before, so maybe less intimate than you were 3 seconds ago. But because we're a small, intimate group, and because I just mentioned the fact that I've been working on some of the ideas that I'm going to be talking about for 17 years, I just want to mention the presence of Professor Clifford Hill, who's here in the front row, who is, although not quite formally a philosophy or linguistics teacher of mine, but was a teacher of mine. He has been a professor for many years at many years at Columbia University, and he did work on frames of reference, spatial temporal frames of reference, the way these are represented in language, and the way these differ cross-linguistically. And that work, when I was much younger, was tremendously inspiring for me. And he's here as a friend and as a former teacher, so I just would like to also introduce him to you. So I'm glad you're here. Okay. Have I broken the ice? I got the morning going. So I want to talk about visual presence, and I'll begin with this idea. If you think of presence, visual presence, projectively, if you think of what is visible as what projects to the eye, say the way you might think about it if you were thinking of artificial perspective, then it turns out, and this is a familiar idea, really, but it can sound paradoxical, it turns out that we visually experience much more than is visible. That is, we experience much more than projects to the eyes. So I'll give an example. If you think of any kind of solid opaque object that you see, you have a sense of its visual presence. It shows up in your visual experience, but you also will have a visual sense of the presence of the back of it. Now, I don't mean that it seems to you that you see the back of it. That would be a crazy claim. It's manifestly evident in your visual experience that you can't see, for example, the back of a tomato that you're looking at. The back of the tomato, after all, is hidden from view. So it's manifestly the case that the back of the tomato is out of view, yet I submit there is a sense in which it shows up in your experience. You have a visual sense of the presence of the unseen part of the tomato. Now you may say, well, you judge, you think, you believe, or you infer that there is a tomato there, or you know, or conjecture, or hypothesize that the tomato has a back there. But I want to say that there's all the difference in the world, experientially, in the first person, phenomenologically, between judging that the tomato has a back and the way in which, when you look at a tomato, you have a visual sense of the presence of the back of the tomato. So the back of the tomato shows up for you in the experience just as the front of the tomato does, although it shows up differently than the way the front of the tomato does it shows up in the scope of your experience nonetheless. In fact, it shows up with a distinct kind of quality, with a distinct kind of character. It shows up in your visual experience precisely as not visible, or as hidden from view, or as occluded, or as out of view. Okay? I think that this phenomenon, visual presence as absence, is very, very pervasive in our perceptual lives. And I just want to take a moment to give you some other examples of it. Well, take this wall, for example. You can see its color, and you can see that it's uniform in color across its surface. You can also immediately see that it varies in brightness across its surface, depending upon where the light directly hits it. So when you see this wall, you have a sense of its color, you see its color, and yet it's obviously, manifestly, variable in color across its surface, because differences in brightness are differences in color. You have a sense of the presence of the color, despite the fact that in some sense, just as the back of the tomato is out of view, in some sense, in these lighting conditions, the color is actually out of view. So psychologists talk about perceptual constancy, but perceptual constancy is precisely an example of what I'm calling the phenomenon of presence in absence. We have a sense of the presence of something which is, in some very manifest, obvious, palpable sensory sense, not visible. Okay? Here's another example which I've discussed much with David Rosenthal at different times in the past. Consider right now our visual experience in the room, sort of your sense of the detail of everybody here in the room. Now, I have a sense of your presence to me visually. I have a sense of your detail and of all of you, your many faces. Now, it's I think, obvious on reflection that it doesn't seem, I'm speaking in the first person, but I ask each of you to imagine it. It's not the case that it seems to me when I see you all and when I have a sense of your presence, that it seems to me as if I have, as it were in my visual consciousness, a representation of each and every one of you in sharp focus, as if there were sort of a picture in my mind. No, it doesn't seem that way at all. Some of you are in focus, some of you are out of focus. The fact of the matter is, I actually focus on, I actually fixate very few of you at any moment in time. And yet, without seeing all of you at a moment in time, I have a sense at a moment in time of the visual presence in my experience of all of you. This is a species of the phenomenon, which I'm now giving examples to try to help you bring into focus for understanding, of presence as absence. But there are other forms of presence, which is sort of hidden presence in experience. That is the way in which our visual experience outstrips the visible, if you narrowly think of the visible in terms of what projects to the eyes. Just think of a simple phenomenon such as when you read, you perceive meanings. But in some sense, it's not the meanings that project to your eyes, it's the typeface, the words. Right? Or I see you and I see a woman. I'm not merely confined in what I see to formal properties, or what you might call strictly perceptual properties, such as shape and color. Right? These are familiar observations, but I want to drive home for us that when you think about your perceptual experience, it's clear that it's part of your visual experience, that it outstrips what is in some sense projectively given. Okay? Now, in some sense, you might think that presence as absence, as I'm calling it, was a kind of virtual presence. And you might want to contrast that with real presence. So you might have the thought, this is an idea which I tried to articulate in Action and Perception. You might have the thought that, look, the front of the tomato is really there. It's the back of the tomato which is present as absent. The apparent colors on the wall are sort of genuinely present in your experience. But the actual color of the wall is in some sense, that's what's present as absent. So here we would then preserve the idea that there's something which is really given. And I think that there's actually an idea that philosophers have, although no philosopher that I know of has ever admitted to holding this idea. But I think that philosophers and many cognitive scientists, when they think about seeing or perceptual consciousness, kind of really think about eating. And the idea they have is somehow to see something really to really have it be present in your experience is to consume it, is to take it inside you and make it internal. And so the idea then is that we just don't eat the back of the tomato, we eat the front of the tomato. We eat the apparent colors, we don't eat the actual color. They're beyond. We need inference or conjecture or hypothesis or some kind of cognitive operation to get to them. But I want to suggest that what I'm calling visual presence as absence is virtual, then actually all perceptual presence is virtual too, including your experience of the front of the tomato. So here's a little kind of first-person phenomenological thought experiment. Imagine you're looking at the front of a tomato. You notice the upper right quadrant, the lower left quadrant. Your attention shifts from its bulbous shape to its color. Maybe you notice some imperfections on the surface. What's interesting is that there's no sense in which you can, in a single act of consciousness, as it were, embrace the whole front of the tomato in your consciousness all at once. That is, it seems to me that there's no perceptual act, there's no perceptual quality which is so simple. Not even a Ganzfeld, sort of a completely uniform fog, which is uniform in luminance in all directions, without any discriminating, without any detail. There's no perceptual stimulus which is so simple as to be such that you can encounter it all at once in a single glance. Perception always presents itself to us as an encounter with something which outstrips and goes beyond what can be grasped in a single glance. There's always that which is present but absent. Always. This presence-absent structure seems to kind of fracturally reiterate itself all the way down. At whatever scale of perception you want to think about, things show up, more shows up than is, strictly speaking, in view at a single moment in time. Now, in a second I'm going to go on and sort of offer how I think we should sort of solve this problem. But let me just mention, as an aside, I've been developing the idea that if you think of the visible as what projects to the eyes, then we are aware of more than is visible in our visual experience. We have a visual sense of the presence of more than projects to the eyes. It's worth just noting, as an aside, that, of course, it's well known that we also are aware of very often much less than projects to the eyes. Right? So this is one of the main upshots of the work on change blindness and intentional blindness that was going on in the mid-1990s that got me interested in this problem in the first place. I won't describe that literature now. What's interesting is that you don't need the fruits of works in psychology labs to notice this fact. Just think of how difficult it is to detect a typo. There's going to be all sorts of information projecting to our eyes without our seeing it, without our experiencing it. Actually, let me mention a very interesting exchange I once had with an artist. I said to the artist, the problem that we face in the science of vision is that of understanding how we enjoy such a rich, detailed, manifold, three-dimensional, spread-out world on the basis of such impoverished information in the retina. And he looked at me like I was crazy and he said, no, that's not the problem of vision. The problem of vision is just the other way around. How is it that we can live in such a richly detailed world and see so little and be so blind? And it strikes me that that's actually an important idea when thinking about precisely why art is so interesting and important to us. Because one of the things that art does, a painting say, is give you something, it's right there, it's flat, it's got no strictly hidden stuff at all. It's all surface. A painting is all surface. And you don't see it right away, or you can't see it. You may never see it. You can look at it and think about it and hit it with your thinking processes, and maybe eventually you'll get to see it. Maybe eventually you'll get to bring it into focus. Anyway, so where we are now is this. I want to suggest that we need a different way of thinking about presence than the resources of the projection idea might suggest. And here's the proposal that I want to make. And this is where embodiment is going to begin to enter into the discussion. Instead of thinking of what is visible as what projects to the eyes, as then processed in the brain, let's think of what is visible or what is visually present. And I know these are not exactly the same for present purposes. I'm using them interchangeably. Let us think of what is visual as what is available to a person from a place. The basic modality of visual presence, I want to say, is presence as availability. A lot of my work on this before action perception was developed in collaboration with a psychologist whose work many of you will know, named Kevin O'Regan. One of the people who first in the laboratory produced convincing change finding experiments. Kevin has a wonderful example he likes to give about to illustrate this basic thought. It's the feeling of being rich. What is the feeling of being rich consist of? Well, it's not. You don't have to have a lot of money in your pocket now. I know probably very few people in this room know what this feeling is like. I have read about it, and so it's on the basis of my research that I'm making this statement. But what does the feeling of being rich consist of? Well, it consists not in having the money in your pocket, but in being able to get the money when you need it. Something along the lines of having a card so that when you're in a jam, you can go to the bank and get the cash. So the feeling of being rich consists in essentially the possession of skills that enable you to get access to money. So the phenomenology is connected to this notion of the availability or access to money, an availability or an access which in turn depends on your possession of skills, knowing how to use the bank card and knowing how to use the bank automat. I want to say something very analogous about the visual cases. In what does my sense now of the visual presence of Professor Rosenthal consist? It consists in the fact that now, by the mere flick of the eye or turn of the head, I can bring him into view. It's not that his being present to me is just that I can reach him. It's now the case that I stand in a relationship to him, which is manifestly such that by movements of my eyes and my body, exercises of a kind of visual-cognitive, visual-sensory-motor skill, I can modulate my relationship to him in relevant ways. In what does my sense of the presence of the back of the tomato look like? Not in the fact that it is open to view, but in the fact that it's now the case that I stand in a relationship to the back of the tomato, which is such that simply by movements, by the exercise of skills which I understand, or which I know, or which I have, I can achieve the relevant access. And I want to say it's more complicated when you talk about the color example on the wall, but I want to suggest that we can think of all visual experience as an activity of achieving access to the environment, making use of visual or sensory motor skill. Let me say a bit more word about skill. If I approach an object that looms in my visual field, if I blink, I disrupt my sensory relation to the object. If I move around it, its profile changes. In these and many other ways, what we do produces sensory events. And whatever else is true about how vision works, it must be the case that perceivers have some kind of at least primitive practical mastery over the ways in which the movements of their own bodies will produce these sensory events. I think perception would be confused otherwise. So we have a kind of mastery of what Kevin O'Regan and I called sensory motor contingencies. And there are the sensory motor contingencies that are characteristic of the use of our eyes in our exploration of the world in that activity, which we call vision. So the idea is that visual presence is something is visually present when it is available, but not just in any old way. It's when it's available in the visual way. What does that mean? When it's available by means of our mastery and exercise of certain kinds of skills, sensory motor skills, skills which ultimately we can think of as being skills of access, skills for achieving access. Now, it's actually much more complicated. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but it's worth underlining some of the details. One of the ways in which it's much more complicated is that seeing is, in an important way, is a two-way transaction. It's not just the case that I see whatever is available to me by the exercise of these skills. In some sense, that would have the consequence that I can see everything, because I can just exercise. I see everything. I just exercise the skills till I achieve the access. That's a consequence of thinking of access and presence as availability. when you see something, you stand in a relationship to it which meets two conditions. One, movements of your body modulate or perturb your sensory relation to it, and changes in it perturb or modify your sensory relation to it. So what I want to suggest is that something is visually present, you have visual access to it when it's there, when it exists, and when you stand in a relationship to it which is such that it is modifiable both by your movements and by its movements. That it is modified by your movements and its movements in ways with which you are familiar, in ways over which you have a kind of a practical understanding. So to summarize what I've said about visual consciousness so far, visual consciousness of an object is a special style of skill-based involvement with the object. It's a special kind of access to it. Now what I want to do, I forget what time I go to.
2, and I'm your moderator. Officially, you go till 12:10.
Okay. What I want to try to do now is generalize this notion of presence beyond vision, and I want to call attention to some features of presence that are, I think, interesting and surprising. But first, I just want to make an aside, and this maybe in a kind of programmatic way connects to the theme of today's meeting. These days, there is the idea that anything that interests us about ourselves, about our human nature, about perception, about consciousness, about the mind, needs somehow to be investigated in the key of neuroscience. And I think that this projective conception that I started out with, of thinking about what presence and visibility is, in a way is exemplifies this. The idea is that we see what projects to the eyes. The seeing happens between the eyes and the brain. The seeing is something that happens, as it were, sort of in isolation. It's something that each of us individually does alone inside of us, so to speak. Seeing finally on this view is a matter of representing what is outside of us, inside of us, and it all happens here. It sort of, with this internalist, representationalist picture, usually also goes kind of intellectualism. That is to say, the idea is that somehow what is going on inside of us, whereby this internal representation is produced, is a kind of cognition. It's inference. It's a conjecture as to the distal cause of the proximal stimulus. Another interesting fact about it is this way of thinking about perception as this internal process tends historically, at least until 2004, to view perception and action as only at best indirectly related to each other. Susan Hurley beautifully sort of named this view the input-output picture. The idea that perception is input from world to mind, then thinking and processing happens, and then action is output from mind to world. So when I say that perception or perceptual presence is when I say that perceptual presence is something's availability to a person from a place, what I'm trying to do is suggest a context in which we reframe what we think that is and where we think it happens. It doesn't happen inside you. It's something the animal does. It's something the animal achieves in the surrounding, which may, of course, also be a social surrounding. Seeing is the exercise of embodied active skills. And it's just, I just want to underscore. No, actually, I'll move on in the interest of time. Now, the general view about perception, which I've adumbrated, I've called actionism in some writing, and the title of today's talk is Actionism. And I just want to, now before I go on to the generalization project that I said I was going to do, just briefly mention some points which may interest us in conversation. I just want to hit them now to forestall at least any potential misunderstanding. The view that I'm calling actionism, namely the view that visual consciousness is a form of skill-based active exploration of the world to achieve access, that does not entail that you only see when you move. If that's not clear, we can discuss that later. Nor does it entail that you only see affordances. I just said earlier, you can see shapes and colors. Nor does it entail, as some writers and thinkers have argued, that seeing is for action. You know, that there's no such thing as seeing just for the sake of enjoying what you see, or just for the sake of contemplation. Nor, I believe, although this is very complicated, nor does it in any way conflict with the basic claims of what is known in the literature as the two visual systems hypothesis, and that is associated with the work of Milner and Goodall. Finally, the view I'm calling actionism, while it insists that seeing is not something that happens between the eye and the brain, it's not something that happens in the brain, it's something that the whole animal achieves in an embodied environmental setting. It is in no way part of the view that the brain is not necessary for perception. The brain is necessary for vision, it is necessary for every aspect of our cognitive lives, but it's not sufficient. And indeed, the project that I carried out in Out of Our Heads, and that I was trying to carry out with Susan Hurley before her death, was really the project of trying to show that it's only when we see the brain as just one element in the brain-body world dynamic system that we actually can begin to have a clue what the brain is doing in the first place. So the claim is not that the brain is not necessary. All right. Now, I want to go on. First point is a straightforward point. It's implicit in everything I've said. The remarks I've made about vision as a skill-based activity of exploration give us the resources to think about modality. On this view, the difference between vision and other sensory modalities is that different sensory modalities rely on different repertoire or suites of skills. So on this view, tactile perception is simply a different style of access to the world. It's a different style of exploration. It's access achieved by a different style. What makes a quality, and notice that the question of modality is a question about consciousness. Right? It's a question about what makes a quality visual, say, as opposed to tactile. And the idea is that what makes it visual as opposed to tactile is that it shows up for us. It's present, thanks to our exercise of certain kinds of skills. Now, notice, this is the second point, that I already touched on this briefly. Presence comes in varieties. The title of my new book is Varieties of Presence. It comes in varieties and it comes in degrees. The way the front of the tomato shows up is different from the way the back of the tomato shows up, is different again from the way the periphery of my visual field shows up. To say they show up is not yet to specify how they show up. We can specify how they show up by noting that they show up visually, but that's the modal distinction. And then within the modal distinction, we can talk in more subtle ways about the way they show up, as being on the periphery, or as being partially concealed, or as being open to view. And these qualitative differences within a modality correspond to the different kinds of things we need to do within a certain modality to achieve access to them. Notice that I said before that when you see something, when you perceive it visually, you stand in a relationship to it which is perturbable by your movement and by its movement, so by your changes and by its changes. We can call that movement dependence and object dependence. Your movements produce sensory events, changes in the object produce sensory events. It's a two-way transaction. Notice we can measure movement and object dependence. There's a sense in which the back of the tomato has less movement dependence than the front of the tomato. The merest quiver of my eye modulates my sensory relation to the front of the tomato, but not to the back of the tomato. Similarly with object dependence, little quivers in the front of the tomato may grab my attention. The ant crawling across the back of the tomato will not modify my sensory relation. So one of the proposals that I want to make is that we can think of the modalities, which I'm now individuating by the skills which we exercise in exploring the environment within those modalities. We can think of them as defining spaces, which we can call access spaces. And to each sensory modality there corresponds a distinct space with its own distinct skill-based structure based on how you navigate within that space bodily, cognitively and bodily. And position in the space, each different position in space corresponds to qualitative differences in the way things show up for you. Now, the part I'm coming to now is, it's the wacky part. Maybe you think everything is wacky, but this is the part which I know is wacky. It's even wacky to me. But it's also, maybe you'll help me find a way to make it less wacky. One of the consequences of actionism, as I've been belaboring, is that in some sense we're visually or perceptually conscious of more than you might think we are. After all, in my view, there's some sense in which I'm visually conscious of the space behind my head because I now stand in a relationship to it whereby I can do that. And I'm visually conscious of the space outside this room because I have a kind of immediate access by means of the exercise of visual skills. Now, I actually think that that's plausible phenomenologically. It seems to me that I do have some sense of the presence of the space behind me or of the space outside me. But how far can we go? How far do we want to go with that? My son is in Paris right now. Do I have a visual sense of the presence of the Eiffel Tower right now? That would be counterintuitive, wouldn't it? But I'd like to consider a case. Consider the case of my conscious thoughts of my friend Dominic. You may remember Dominic, who lives in Berlin. I don't mean the thought that Dominic is in Berlin. I mean something else. When I think of Dominic in the way I'm now describing, he shows up for me in my thinking. He has a certain vivid presence. He's present to mind. Not that he is present. Not that it seems that he's present. I'm not in the state of falsely believing he's here when he's not. No, it seems to me, in no sense does he seem to me to be present. He doesn't show up to me now as here. He shows up to me here now as there. He shows up to me here now as there. The quality of the way in which he shows up in my thinking is as there. So when I think about Dominic in this way, he shows up as present as absent, in something like the same presence-absent structure I've been suggesting as a sort of hallmark of visual presence. So here's my thought. An absent friend can show up in your thoughts in very much the way that the occluded portions of the things you see can show up, as present but absent. And then here the thought is as present as available. And that seems to me, and we could argue about this till the cow comes home, till the cows come home, but that seems to me phenomenologically right. Dominic, so here's the claim. It's exploring the consequence of the theory, but it's also meant to have a kind of phenomenological bite to it. Dominic's presence and absence, to me now, and you can each pick your favorite example, is different from that of my sense of the visual presence of the things around me now. But the difference is one of degree, not of kind. And actionism has precisely the resources to explain this, given the fact that if you think of presence as availability, and if you think of it as a defining space, these are infinite spaces. The axes go on forever. Dominic scores very low on the movement and object-dependent measures, but I submit he doesn't, it's not non-zero. So what I'm proposing is that from the standpoint of actionism, thought itself is sometimes, we could say, a kind of extended perception. thought is extended perception when one deploys sensory motor skills to achieve access to something or someone very remote. So the thought then is that Dominic shows up for me precisely as standing in a quasi-perceptual relation to me, namely the relation of being too far away to be seen. So I've been going through points by way of drawing out larger implications of the actionist account of vision. I talked about you can generalize it to a different account of modality, how it allows you to conceptualize our perceptual lives as involving skill spaces whose very ground or basis is fleshed out in different kinds of skills that we have. I suggested that on this view, and you might think this is a bug in the view, but I think it's a feature. The boundary between what's present and what is not, or what is visually present and what is merely thought present, becomes a fluid boundary. And I think that that actually does justice to something like the imagination. There is a more general point about perception and thought that I'd like to make now. On this view that I'm, from the standpoint of the view that I'm laying out now, which is beginning for me to take the shape no longer of a theory of perception, but of a general theory of access. So consider, perceptual presence is one kind of availability. Now thinking of perceptual presence, including all the different subvarieties. It's one kind of presence to mind. An object is perceptually present when our access to it depends on the exercise of, among other things, sensory motor skills. I say among other things because I don't mean to rule out the requirement that there are other skills or other knowledge as well. Of course, objects can show up in consciousness without being perceived. For example, when I think of Aristotle is present to my mind. And arguably in this case, I feel no compulsion to say he's perceptually present. He's thought present. That is, he's present thanks to a different battery of skills. The exercise of a different battery of skills. Descriptive, linguistic, sociolinguistic, conceptual skills. So from the standpoint of a general theory of access, thought and perception, my thoughts about Aristotle, my conscious mental experience of Dominic in Berlin, and my perceptual experiences all differ in a way along a similar spectrum. Thought and perception differ the way the different sensory modalities differ. They are different styles of achieving access to the world. You know, in philosophy and in the history of psychology, perception and thought mark a real, there's really a big boundary between this. And so there's huge debates in philosophical literature about whether perception is conceptual, or historically about whether perception comes before thought, or thought comes before perception. And a lot of people think you have to be able to understand what you see in order to see it, or others say, no, you must see it first in order to get a grip on it, in order to form a thought about it. These are big issues. But I want to say that, in a way, instead of thinking that somehow, what I want to suggest is a picture of sort of a general problem of presence. There's presence as access, and then we can, under this generic category, so the generic generic modality of all presence is availability or access. And then under this, perception and thought just represent two different ways of achieving access. Where they differ is by differences in the kinds of skills that we use when we carry them out. And so the different sensory modalities, seeing, touching, etc., they differ from what's going on over here, only in that here, what we call the basic skill of access that we use is a concept. Whereas over here, I've been at least privileging or emphasizing sensory motor skills. On this view, a concept, you know, the German word for concept, and I believe this is also true of the etymology of the Latin word concept itself, but is a begriff. It's something. It's a handle. It's something. It's a way of grabbing. It's a way of grabbing onto something. To have a concept, as Wittgenstein said, is to have an ability or technique for achieving access to something. So one of the upshots of this view is the hope of trying to unify perception and thought within a common framework. And one consequence, one interesting upshot of this is, on the one hand, it does actually have as a consequence, if you think of sensory motor skills as essentially conceptual skills, as a kind of conceptual skill, it shows a way in which we can think of concepts and understanding as involved in perception, I think without running the risk of over-intellectualizing perception.
Excuse me, what is the second word?
Sorry about that. Sorry, it's touching, yeah, yeah. But I meant this to be an abbreviation for seeing, touching, smelling, hearing, and so on. Now, I'm going to wrap up now. Well, not really. The following remarks are all in conclusion, but actually I realize now when I remind myself of what they are that they're not exactly simple. But there are three final things I want to mention. The first is the implications of this way of thinking about this for what philosophers call the problem of intentionality. For philosophers, intentionality has to do with reference or aboutness, the directedness of our thoughts to things. My thought, that Dominic is in some sense involved in the individual in which thought it is I'm having or which experience it is I'm having. It's a Dominic-directed thought, and that seems to be an important feature of our experience. So philosophers often like to investigate the reference or intentionality relation, or as John Searle called it, the aboutness relation. I can think about Mick Jagger, I can think about my children, I can think about New York City. But I want to call attention to the fact that each of these things, New York City, Mick Jagger, my children, are present now in my thoughts in different ways. And they're present in different ways because of all the different skills I have and ways in which things I need to do to be able to achieve access to them in thought or in experience. I'm sort of fairly, I'm sort of thinking here of I don't know Mick Jagger personally, so my access to Mick Jagger, my ability to think about him, is mediated by a vast array of socially constituted media and shared conceptual resources for getting from me to him. But they suffice to get from me to him. I should say I have been in the same room with him. And it would be easy, in some sense I do have, there's a real sense in which I have access to him. But the kind of access I have to one of you now is not comparable. The modality whereby I would achieve access to you is hardly to be compared. Think about Aristotle. Think of what vast shared sociolinguistic structures need to be in place in order for me to achieve access to Aristotle. There are chairs on the other side. You might as well just walk around. So what I want to say is that if we start to think of all the varieties of the ways in which things show up to mind, varieties whose differences can be made precise because they precisely correspond to the different ways in which we would achieve access to them, we begin to realize that maybe it's a mistake to think that there is one intentionality relation. Actually, I just realized, what time, my watch is slow. I just realized.
Well, we started a little late, but
what time is it?
essentially you have another 7 minutes.
That's really all I need. One of the places, now this brings me to the second point. So the first upshot is this. Instead of thinking about reference or aboutness, we should start to think about presence. And when we do that, we start to realize that there is not a single reference or aboutness relationship, but there is a sort of a multitude of them that can be understood in terms of the multitude, the variable ways in which we know our way around in conceptual and social and linguistic and perceptual structures. Now the next point I want to make is related to this, and it's that presence is, as I will say, fragile. Now, the way to illustrate the idea of the fragility of presence, consider that if you do, we have a logician in the room. You know, the way what logicians do is they take letters and they assign values to them, and they give a formal grammar, and then they put the language to work for whatever purposes it is they're doing in mathematics. So in some sense, the assignment of values to signs is something with formal languages that happens antecedent to the use of those languages. But what's very interesting is that our own linguistic experience is nothing like that. Misunderstanding each other, failing to understand what the other means, re-articulating what was actually meant, offering definitions, correcting usage, those are all things we do within language. Linguistic mistakes, linguistic misunderstandings, linguistic conflicts don't force us to step outside of language and rejigger it. They're something we adjudicate within language, and it's part of our basic, I think, of our basic linguistic capacities that we do that, and we do that. That's part of what, that sort of second order skill is actually what our first order capacities to be language users in part consists in. In other words, it is part of our very practice that the practice itself is vulnerable to slippage and to mistake. I think something like this is true then, if now I want to apply this to the sort of the presence of Mick Jagger in my life. What are all the ways in which I could learn that Mick Jagger is not what I took him to be? Could I, you know, here's a better example. Suppose we discovered that actually there never had been a person named Moses. I submit to you that the possibility of the non-existence of Moses, like the possibility that I might misunderstand you when we're talking to each other, is, if you like, pre-shadowed or foreshadowed in the way in which we think about Moses, in the way in which he shows up for us. Such that for it to turn out that there was no Moses would force a kind of change in force us to readjust our beliefs and our outlook in a very different way than it would if I were to learn, say, that Mick Jagger didn't exist, or that Hillary Clinton didn't exist. Or the closer you get to home, the more radical revisions have to make. And I feel like I'm not finding the way to really make this idea crisp. The thought is this: we are like, when we are perceivers, or when we are thinkers, or when we are communicators, our achievement of presence is always an ongoing work in progress. It's always something we're doing, and the possibility of its failure is part of the project itself, not something which forces the project to end. So merely, it's like an outfielder. An outfielder is in constant motion, judging, perceiving, responding, reacting, always knowing he might not catch the ball, always knowing he might trip, always knowing that it's a routine possibility to just go on, catch the ball, and return to the dugout at the end of the inning. This is important when we think about the big problem that faces accounts of intentionality, which is the possible non-existence of the objects of our thought. There isn't one problem about the possible non-existence of the objects of our thought, because the possible non-existence of the object of our thought is, if you like, built into what it is to think. And I think one of the pernicious influences of logic, no offense intended, is somehow the idea that if an object should not exist, that we think we're thinking about or talking about, that somehow this is crisis, this is the end of civilization, this is the breakdown of consciousness. But really, it's just an opportunity to clarify ourselves and re-adjudicate our relationship to the world in which we find ourselves. Now, the last remark I want to make, and this is very brief, this is just a momentary remark, is I use the word style at several junctures throughout the talk. I talked about perception as compared to thought, as a style of active exploration of the world. I talked about seeing as a different style of active exploration, and I spelled out the idea of style in terms of the notion of the different sort of suites of skills that we have in these different domains. I just wanted to call your attention to my usage of the word style, because style is a very low prestige notion. You know, not in all quarters, but you know, style is associated with fashion or you know, convention, manuals of style. You can type it this way or write it that way or punctuate this way or punctuate that way. You don't find style in the indexes of very many books in cognitive science or philosophy. It's an interesting fact. Whereas if I'm right, there's a sense in which style ought to be a sort of a central idea. For style is really the way you do something, and styles, our entire cognitive lives, through perception, through thinking, through the imagination, through analytical thought, are essentially ways of exploring the world. They are styles of active exploration of the world. So I'll stop there and open up for discussion. Thank you.
Thanks.